Your argument is largely that, well, it starts with the assertion that the 2016 was the last election of the Cold War. Tell us what you mean by that.
Yeah, so we tend to think of the Cold War as basically a discrete conflict with a very specific adversary, the Soviet Union, that ended at a particular moment in time. So either 1989 or 1991. But my point is that it was actually a lot more than that. That what the Cold War generated were a set of views that were held really across both parties by national elites that came together in the mid-20th century. And these were views about domestic and foreign policy, about why the U.S. was exceptional, and really why it was morally superior to other nations. And to me, the key point is that actually perceived victory over the Soviet Union supercharged these assumptions. And in post-1989, they made them, in a way, like even more entrenched than they'd been during parts of the Cold War. Just think of, social conflict in the 1960s and 70s. And it's only now, for reasons that we can discuss, that consensus is really broken down permanently. And I want to say that there are lots of problematic and troubling things about that breakdown, but there's also some good things about a kind of new openness when it comes to political possibility.
All right, I want to circle back around to that because I really, having grown up, at least in part, during the Cold War, I mean, and having some both political and just sort of contextual awareness during that time, it really did strike me, your piece. It reminded me of a dynamic that I think is largely switched or changed in how much our foreign policy impacted domestic politics and in such a specific way. But before we get there, let's talk about the ideological openness pre-Cold War. Describe for us, largely like what that meant in both conceptually and practically.
Yeah, I mean, so I'd say that like over the last year, there have been a lot of requiems for America, but really what people mean is an idea of the US that was a contingent product of the Depression, World War II, and Soviet competition. And if we actually just look further back than the 1940s and 1950s, we'd see a US that looks really different than what we've always taken for granted. So it's marked by open class conflict, where you have very powerful labor unions and a powerful labor movement that understands itself as effectively at war with business. We have extreme forms of inequality domestically. You have a constitutional system that's really dysfunctional because it has so many veto points. It makes it very difficult for ordinary citizens to just implement popular policy. White nationalism and the presumption that the country is a white republic is just a bedrock commitment that a majority of citizens have. And you have institutions like the Ku Klux Klan that are incredibly powerful, not just in the South, but in the North and the West, in places like Indiana and Oregon. And all of this creates a dynamic where you have really perhaps like the two most powerful popular political positions as a brand of kind of a mixture of white nationalism and ethnic populism on the right that links folks like, Father Coughlin in the 1930s all the way back to Andrew Jackson. And then on the left, you have an emergent democratic socialist position that's interested in democratizing political institutions, strengthening the position of labor, confronting problems of race and class together as structural issues. So really, the country is marked by a recognition of intensive conflict and an understanding that, maybe the problem is the basic institutions of government and economy, which have to be transformed.
And contextually, I mean, there was also, I mean, obviously we had, we're going into and I guess attempting to come out of the Great Depression during that time after coming in from a Gilded Age. And so it's interesting because on some level, the contexts are similar, as well as not just the absence of the Cold War. But so we had that going on in the, pre 1940, let's say. And then the World War II happens and is immediately sort of leads us into the sort of the post-war era and the Cold War. how much of just tell us what you reckoned happened there in terms of
So
that
I,
change.
yeah, so sorry to interrupt. Yeah, so I think that there are three kind of decisive events. There's the emergence of the New Deal coalition in the context of the Depression. There's the U.S. participation in World War II and its confrontation with Nazi Germany, and then there's the Cold War rivalry with the Soviet Union. So I can just quickly like link the three if you think that would be helpful.
Yeah, let's go through each one in terms of what the implications were for that pre-existing political order, or I guess disorder.
Yeah. So the first with the New Deal coalition. So we have to remember, and this is again should be familiar from our contemporary constitutional system, is that most of the branches of government in the U.S. then as today are just not democratic. So you really only have one half of one branch, the House of Representatives, that's organized around principles really of majority rule. The Senate overrepresents historically like Southern interests, but rural interests. You have the presidency that was indirectly elected, electoral college. You have the Supreme Court. And that it was the Depression that really actually strengthened the hand of labor, in particular unions like the CIO, to in part kind of take over and transform the Democratic Party and to give the Democratic Party massive supermajorities, what you needed in order to be able to implement policy. You couldn't just have ordinary majorities, you'd have to have rolling supermajorities. And these supermajorities produced all of the social welfare programs that we associate with the mid-20th century. And what they did is, in a way, kind of counterintuitively, they provided a legitimacy to American institutions and to the American economy because the economy was able to actually generate meaningful reforms. So that was a key thing that emerges in the 30s and 40s. The second thing was World War II, which is isolationism had always been perhaps the most common position when it came to American foreign policy. That the U.S. was safe behind the oceans, that we shouldn't get involved in like the problems that you see in Europe. And the confrontation with the Soviet Union really undermined isolationist sentiment and emphasized the idea that the U.S. had a global responsibility and that this global responsibility was bound in a key way to not just anti-fascism, but to a commitment to racial equality. That Nazism and racism were kind of threats to the American way. And then that ends up connecting to what happens during the Cold War, which is the Soviet Union, you have to remember, was like a real competitor, an ideological competitor for hearts and minds across the world, and especially in a decolonizing global South. The Soviet Union has an account of economic development through state-managed policies. It has a commitment to anti-imperialism and anti-racism. And in this context, what Cold War elites rediscover is this idea of the American Declaration of Independence as highlighting how from the very founding the U.S. has always been committed to universal equality and how the U.S.'s interests are the world's interests. And for that reason, it kind of deserves global preeminence. And so all of this fuses together to produce a set of views. When it comes to national identity, the U.S. is anti-imperialist to its core. It's committed to universal equality. When it comes to foreign policy, it has the right to be the first nation among equals, that it enjoys global preeminence because of the inherent justice of its own commitments. And when it comes to domestic policy, two things. The institutions are essentially just, the form of constitutional government, and the capitalist economy is essentially just. Both just need minor tweaks, and the proof of the justice of the institutions are the achievements of the New Deal period. And it's why, the kind of old joke about the Democratic Party was that by the time you get to the 1950s, it's the second most pro-capitalist party on the face of the earth, only slightly behind the Republican Party.